Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is Franz Sidney, so welcome to Create with Franz. And today we have a really interesting topic, which I don't think I've ever mentioned in the show before in 4 years. So it was just about time to delve into what we can call internalized racism. So race is something that can be a problem if we think it's a problem, meaning is that idea that we are different from other people stopping us from reaching our full potential? We're going to see the symptoms, the strategies, how to get out of that, and really create the life that you deserve by talking to a very specialized person here. And her name is Sandra Kushner. So, welcome to the show, Sandra.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and hopefully, this can be helpful to anyone that might be experiencing this, either consciously or unconsciously.
Yes, we know that, well, I know, but you guys will know in a minute that Sandra is actually the founder of Meridian Counseling. So she's a licensed marriage and family therapist in Los Angeles, in the US, in case you don't know. And then she's very, very good in talking about what happens inside here. So outside, everything is good, but inside there is a big tempest. And so I wanted to really start with the symptoms. What happens when you have this internalized racism?
Yes. So I want to talk a little bit about internalized racism, and I'm going to share a little bit about my own experience with understanding, especially after October 7th and the terrorist attacks that happened in Israel, my own internalized anti-Semitism as a Jewish woman, as a first generation woman whose parents immigrated to America from Ukraine. And so for me, October 7th was a very pivotal moment in understanding how this plays out in myself and in my relationships and in other traumas that I've experienced. And it was sort of an eye-opening moment of how these things compound for people that come from marginalized groups or who have generational trauma in their family system or because of their race or culture. So the symptoms that I experienced for me after October 7th, I always felt that being Jewish was a privilege in a lot of ways because me as a Jewish woman, especially after I moved to Los Angeles, I felt like I got so many opportunities and kind of got to progress my career in really amazing ways through the Jewish community. So I never really experienced anti-Semitism overtly until October 7th happened. And my parents are actually immigrants from the USSR. They came to America in 1991 when the USSR collapsed. And they immigrated to Salt Lake City, Utah as refugees through Jewish Family Services. And, they acculturated, they Americanized. And I really grew up in a very sheltered environment. There weren't a lot of Jewish people in Utah at that time. There still are not very many. And my parents would always bring up anti-Semitism and their experience of being discriminated against for being Jewish, both in Ukraine and in their experience when they moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, and had this different religious background than most of the people there. And for me, I never really experienced that because I was born in America. I did not immigrate. I felt like I had community in Salt Lake City. I was able to really make friends. But I always did have this feeling of embarrassment of who my family was and our cultural background and where we came from, and this deep awareness that we were very different. But I never attributed it to internalized anti-Semitism. So I want to backtrack a little bit and kind of give a clearer definition because we have talked a lot in the last few years since George Floyd and obviously October 7th happening about racism and overt racism and how, minority groups and people from different backgrounds, different races experience discrimination in this world. But not a lot of people have defined what internalized anti-Semitism or internalized racism means. And so what that actually is it's an internal experience of disliking or disowning parts of yourself based on your cultural or racial background. So for me, it now in hindsight, right? I was always embarrassed of my family for being who they are because they were different, especially in the environment that I grew up with, which was everyone was LDS and more white presenting than my parents were. And I was so embarrassed of them that I really distanced myself from my cultural background as a child, right? Like I really tried to lean into being Americanized. I started dressing and acting more like the kids around me. I didn't really want my parents to dress a certain way when they came to parent teacher conferences. And it was this feeling of shame and embarrassment of my family for just being who they are that I experienced as a child because I felt like who they are was so different that I would be ostracized or left out or judged.
Mm.
And when you go through this, right, over a lifetime, throughout your childhood, throughout your adolescence, that becomes internalized as like, oh, I don't fit in. I am different than the people around me. There is something inherently wrong with me. And since humans have an inherent need for belonging and community, this can be really traumatic to your sense of self, right? Because it feels like in order to be accepted and loved and wanted, that you have to conform to the people around you. And if you're different, that there's something wrong with you deep, deep down. So I carried all of this, but I didn't have awareness or vocabulary to define it until October 7th happened. And that was kind of this like awakening for me in a lot of ways of all these things that I had like suppressed and all this shame and all this stuff that I had been carrying around being Jewish and being different and growing up in a place where there weren't a lot of Jewish people. And so I started really digging into what does generational trauma look like? What does internalized racism and internalized anti-Semitism manifest in relationships and in how you show up in this world? And this past year for me has been really dedicated to understanding myself better in this way, and then also helping people from minority groups to understand how this internalized like self-hate might be coming up in their relationships and their mental health and their self-esteem
Mm.
and really helping them break free of that.
Yes, it's so many layers, isn't it? Like everything, how you dress, or what you might be eating or not eating, what you drink and you don't drink, or what you do on Saturday or on Sunday. So people are saying, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And you have to explain over and over. And I have to say, in a different way, I kind of sympathize a lot because, I moved from Sardinia, which is a own culture, all the way to Milan, where all my parents, relatives were, my cousins and everything. And half of my family, they grew up in Brazil. My mom grew up in Brazil. So we had all this culture mess in the family. And one of my aunties, she's from Brazil. And when she came to Italy, she was like, wow, this is so different. She took a few years and she felt all right, but she's like, I'm Brazilian. I'm like, oh, wow, you're Brazilian. But depending on which culture, if you say I'm Albanian, that's not going to be very nice, or I'm African. So there are ways we perceive culture differently, and we might make other people feel differently because they are not like us, because the human mind does that, doesn't it? It's like, if you are different, you must be wrong. Just something. You have to be like me. If you don't fit the little frame, the little box where I put you. And that was really amplified when I was in the missionary training center in Provo, Utah. So I was in Italian in Provo. Everything was different. Oh, you're Italian. Do Italians have shoes? I'm like, we have the biggest exporters of fashion shoes in the world. Yes, we have shoes. I thought Italians walk on bare feet. I mean, really? What is that? The ignorance about my country. And then I moved to the UK, and another huge change because the UK has their own ideas about Italy. So it keeps changing. And now I'm in the United States, 2 months now, 2.5 months, and back again. Oh, you're from Italy. Oh, I love your accents. But it can go down to making you feel sometimes, is it that different that people don't understand me or something? So there could be all sorts of comments. Luckily, with me, everyone has been so good. I really have no complaints. But we can do all this talking internally so that everyone is nice, but we think, well, maybe I shouldn't wear that type of clothes. Or think if you're Indian from India and you got this wonderful sari and you show up and you're the only person wearing that, everyone is in jeans. you're going to stand out,
Mhm.
people, and then you're going to be proud of it or not proud. And so what is the difference between feeling proud of your culture, although you are completely blended in the community, and feeling like you have to hide it? Where is the switch? What did you have to do to change that?
I mean, I think there's a few aspects that need to be considered. I think as a child or as a teenager, you have a bigger need in order to blend in and fit in. A big need, right, for teens especially
Hmm.
is belonging, right? Like they want their friends to accept them, they want to fit in. And so I think it depends on like what age or which developmental milestone you're in when you are someone that comes into a place where no one is like you, right? And the messaging that you get, like, oh, my family eats different food than all my friends, or my family dresses different or has a different accent, right? And for depending on where you're at in your own personal development, right, it can manifest differently. Obviously, even for adults, it can be hard, right? If you come from a different culture, you have an accent, or you move to a place where there's not a lot of people that look like you or understand your background and where you're coming from, and you
Hmm.
start a new job, you might have some anxiety around that. But at that point, when you're an adult, you usually have a stronger sense of self, right? You've lived more life. You've been able to, your brain's developed, you've had more experiences. Usually by the time you're an adult, you have a little bit more confidence and grounding in who you are and a little bit more appreciation for where you come from and your differences. But for kids and for teenagers, right, it's very different. They're still figuring out, who am I? How do I belong in this world? How do I relate to the people around me? Right. And they can be very embarrassed of being different because all they want is to fit in and be accepted. And so
Yes.
I do think it depends where you're at in your own personal journey of like personal growth and development and life stage of how this shows up in a lot of ways. But what I do think in order to overcome it, right, is to, from an early age, if you are someone that is an immigrant or from a different racial background or from a different religion in a place where there's people that are different from you, I think it's very important to have those conversations with radical honesty and radical openness in your family, right? So if you have children or you have teenagers, and you move to a place where other people don't look like them, it's important to hold space and talk about, what is your experience at school? Like what feelings come up for you? Like, do you feel like your culture is accepted by the people around you or not? Right. And I think that responsibility lies on the adults in the family, right? To hold space for the child or the adolescent's experience
Hmm.
and to empathize with, like, it's hard being a teenager, it's hard being a kid, it's hard being in a place where you look and are different than the people around you, and to validate that while also instilling like a pride and understanding of like your cultural history and how there are places in the world where you do belong and people do look like you, and that's something that you should be proud of, right, not ashamed of, right? So it's kind of that balance of both. And what I have seen a lot, both as someone who's first gen and has immigrant parents, and also as a therapist, is there is a problem that happens when the parents themselves also have internalized racism, right? So they have their own guilt or their own shame around being different, right? So they aren't able to have those conversations and they aren't able to hold that space in order to help their children process this experience, right? Because they themselves are uncomfortable with the differences that they have from the people around them. And so this is why it's so important to become aware of, like, do I have internalized racism towards myself as an adult? Right. So I now see after October 7th that I did have internalized anti-Semitism, and that if I had moved to a place where there weren't a lot of Jewish people, I probably wouldn't be able to have these types of conversations because I would be kind of dis disowning and moving away from my own discomfort around this topic, right? And the only way to really understand it is to give it space and give it empathy and to hold space for the pain and the rejection and the trauma and the layers of historical discrimination that people from marginalized groups have experienced, right? And to allow yourself to grieve, not just for yourself, but to grieve for your ancestors and to grieve for your parents and your grandparents and historical um, people in your family lineage that have gone through discrimination and trauma.
Yes. It makes sense. And also because we don't have to have a different color of skin. It could be just we are from another nation. And just was it on the 11th, I think, we went to Casper for my biometrics, for my passport, for my residency here. And just there are some trails and historical sites, and they show you in detail how all these people from Europe in 1800, 1830 onwards moved in mass by the thousands to Salt Lake City, coming from New York, Missouri, Nauvoo. They went up Illinois, they went all the way to Salt Lake. And hundreds of them died, of course, every month there were hundreds dying, and they passed through all these sacrifices. And they were people from the entire Europe. So they were all emigrating in this desert land where all there was the Indians. And so there was all this stuff that happened with the Indians, and the newly formed American government over there was doing the laws and see. And you can see that everyone had their own culture, and they had to do this exercise of learning how people from Belgium were going to talk to Italians, and Italians talking to Swiss, the Swiss talking to the German. They just had to be one people. The Americans, they were the first, but none of them was the same as the others. They're all different. They were wearing rags. They suffered everything, and that brought them together, and they created this beautiful nation that today is, really a concentrated of all the culture in the world, and people kept coming. There were funds to have immigrants here. We all know the stories, and you think about these immigrants, they have all these hopes to go and just fit in and be accepted. And then the ones that are already here in America, they're all coming from immigrants. So it's just beyond me to think that they would judge somebody because they are from this country or the other country. You are not from here. If you do your DNA test, you will realize you're not from there anyway. It's very rare. I mean, I got 100% Sardinian DNA so far, 100%. So apparently the Sardinians just came from a ship and went, boo, that was it. But most people have so many veins of culture, and I think there should be an enriching part of our culture. And one thing that really makes me annoyed when I hear lots of Italians, they moved to the States about 1950s, and they have kids here. They change their names from Giovanni to John, from Maria to Mary, so very hard to do genealogy there. And they say in the family, we're not going to speak Italian. We're just going to speak English. So we don't look like foreigners.
Yeah.
And so these new generations, of which some I interviewed last week, they don't speak a word of Italian. So they got for the first time in Italy, like 30s and 40s. They're like, oh, is that where we are from? I feel something there. And I always wish the parents that have such a big shame about being different and have a Broccolino accent, New York. And why did it feel such a shame? It's because we want to be accepted, not rejected. And the human mind tends to reject what is different because it could be dangerous.
Yes, 100%.
And
that is my experience to a T of, I was embarrassed of my parents having Russian accents and eating Russian food. And I would be like, please, like, don't have weird food when my friends come over, right? Like, hide who you are, right? And it was so interesting to me because when I went to graduate school to be like, I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah. And in Salt Lake City, Utah, if you've ever been there, there's a lot of Scandinavian background, right? So there's a lot of people with like blonde hair and blue eyes and, very, very white. And so in Utah, I actually did not feel like I was white. I didn't identify as white, even though I like outwardly look white. I have dark features. My dad is a Sephardic Jew, so he's like darker skinned. And when I moved to California and I went to graduate school, I went to school with a bunch of kids that were first generation Hispanic or Black or Chinese or Indian. So I finally was around other people that were first gen like me, but they did not accept me either because they viewed me as like a rich white girl. And I was like very confused because I was like, in Salt Lake City, I am not white. Like I'm one of you, I'm a minority, right? And here you're just viewing me as a privileged white girl. And at the time, I was very upset and felt very rejected and misunderstood and very angry because I wasn't seeing myself from the lens of how they were seeing me
Mm.
outwardly presenting. And that was the interesting thing for me to understand about like anti-Semitism, for instance, right? Like Jews, a lot of Jews, there's darker skinned Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, there's Ethiopian Jews, but there's a lot of Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, right? And we look white. However, we are not white, right? We are Jewish and we have not been accepted into white culture, but other minority groups still see us as white. And so it's been interesting because this past year I've realized like Jewish people are the scapegoat for white anger. So minority groups, instead of accepting us as another minority group, they
Mhm.
view us as white people that are oppressing them instead of a minority group that has also been discriminated against, right? So it leads to this feeling of like, we don't belong with white people and we also don't belong with other minority groups. And both are rejecting us, right? And what you have seen historically is what you're talking about is a lot of Jewish people have become more a culture like they disowned being Jewish and they become more whitewashed in a lot of ways, right? They lean more into the Anglo-Saxon white norms instead of maintaining their Jewish culture and heritage in order to belong and feel safe, right? And to not be rejected by this group or this group. So that was a very weird
Mm.
experience for me of what you're talking about of like, well, where do I go? Right? Because I don't fit in here and I don't fit in here either.
It's a problem. And
Yeah.
you are here because you overcame the problem. So, what was your method or protocol? How did
Yeah.
you work inside your mind to get yourself out and gain the self confidence about being who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think after October 7th and the terrorist attacks, like it was just so traumatic and so raw. I had a full-blown trauma reaction. Even though I'm here in Los Angeles, I was not in Israel. For 2 weeks, I did not sleep. I was having nightmares that people were coming for me. And I realized like my body woke up, my genetics woke up, my epigenetics got triggered. And so it was like all this historical trauma of having ancestors that went through the Holocaust and lived through Stalin. I couldn't avoid it anymore. So it all came to the surface. And I spent this past year really unpacking like and providing myself with a lot of space to grieve and have empathy for how sad it is that my great grandma and my grandma and even my parents that they felt like they weren't safe and that they didn't belong and that they had to hide who they are and that their life was in danger just because they were Jewish. Right. And when I stood back and I looked at like, that's so sad that these people, just because of who they are, felt like they weren't enough or they weren't valuable just because they have a certain blood or a certain ethnicity and that they felt like they had to like hide these parts of themselves in order to have a job or in order to have friends or in order to be belong in their society. And I just gave myself space to like really sit with what that means, right? And how that has been carried on generationally and how that's impacted me, right? Like what did that do to me to know that my grandmother and my great grandmother and my mother all experience discrimination for just being who they are, and how can I be the person that breaks that cycle? And part of that was I let myself get mad, right? People always say anger is a bad emotion, but I actually think like anger can be a protective emotion. And if you allow yourself to be angry about things that you should be angry about, right? It can actually help you become stronger, and it can help you have better boundaries, and it can help you be more empowered and self-honoring. And so I allowed myself to feel the grief, and I allowed myself to feel the anger that has been in my family for generations. And I said, I'm not going to let this continue. It's going to end with me. I'm not going to let my children grow up feeling like they're not good enough just for being who they are. And what that led to was me taking a good hard look at my life of like, which friendships, which relationships are no longer serving me, right? Like after October 7th, it became very clear to me some of the people in my life that I thought were my friends were not actually my friends, right? And that I needed to cut those relationships off in order to protect myself. And the way that I looked at it was when the Holocaust happened, it wasn't just Hitler and the Nazis that let the Holocaust happen, right? Jewish people were turned in by their friends. They were turned in by their coworkers. They were turned in by their neighbors. And sometimes the people that you think are there unconditionally actually don't have good intentions for you, right? And so it allowed me to get very clear of like who is in my corner and who is not in my corner,
Mm.
and to cut the people who aren't in my corner out of my life was a moment for me of like protecting my peace and protecting my culture and protecting myself generationally as well, right? I also feel like I stopped feeling as ashamed about what I look like and my culture. I started wearing a Jewish star. I dyed my hair back to brown, and I leaned into understanding my culture and really understanding how it's impacted myself and my family this past year. And then the biggest thing that I think for me has been important has been to help other people who are from minority groups or who are first gen or who are Jewish or who have internalized racism or anti-Semitism towards themselves, to understand how important it is to break that cycle and to really like end this self-hatred and disowning of culture and disowning of self with them, right? Because to me, when you heal this part of yourself, you're not just healing you, you're healing your parents' wounds, your great grandparents' wounds, your generational trauma, right? When you start understanding how this has impacted your family system for millennia, right? You can really have a lot of empathy and end it there and create a new normal for your future kids and your future family, and hopefully make people feel proud about being different and feel proud about their racial or their religious or their ethnic background, right? Because it's so beautiful to come from different places and have different cultures and look different. Like life would be so boring if we were all the same. So we need to cherish who we are, and we need to be proud of who we are, right? And we need to make sure that we understand that, our great grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, they went through hell, but it's our responsibility to find healing and to make sure that that hell doesn't continue onward. So that's been my mission this past year, is to lean in to being who I am and to be more proud of it, and to understand, who's in my corner and who needs to be cut out of my life, and to not feel guilty about that, right? Because if people are racist, or if they don't like you, or if they're anti-Semitic, or if they have judgments about you for being who you are, they're not your people. And you shouldn't give them the energy or the power over who you are and your self-esteem, because they're just not worth it, right? The right people are empathetic and kind and curious and open to your differences, not judgmental or mean about them. So, yeah, that's been the biggest thing for me this past year. And one thing that I want to tell anyone who may be experiencing this is to really allow themselves to feel the feelings of anger and grief, and to hold space for that. Like you have to go through those negative emotions in order to get to the other side, which is healing and love and connection and empathy. But in order to get there, you do have to walk through the storm.
I love that. Walk with a story. When you were talking about this, and and I was just thinking about my own ancestry. I realized many, many years ago, way before I joined the LDS church, so my family was a Catholic, and my mom had this really big prompting of looking up her family history and see who's in my family from this side and that side. So she spent an inordinate amount of time looking up where the family came from. And she found a lot more info from my father's side. And so as my mom was doing this research, she found out that the brother of a grandfather of my dad had emigrated to Argentina in the 1900s. And so they went, oh, there's a new family. So they went in Olside, which is a small town in Sardinia, where my dad was from, and they did some research. And somebody said, oh, yeah, because they know the genealogy of everyone. Yeah, these people went to Argentina so many years ago. Here's the names. So my mom did all this research, and she found out we have over 100 living Argentinian relatives, all from Olside, this tiny town. And so they got in touch. They found out where they are. They went to see them in Argentina, and lo and behold, these people, so basically a century after emigrating, they had all the Sardinian recipes, the new Sardinian language. They had the costumes, they had all the food and the habits, and it was like, these are just the Sardinian people on holiday here, you know. It's just mad. And it was so good for my parents to see that they kept the heritage, kept the language, kept so much stuff, although Spanish was their first language, you know, Argentina. And when they came around, we went to Sardinia, also they came to Tuscany to see us. It was just as if we were always been, you know, we've always been in touch. It was just your blood is calling, but they were completely integrated in the Argentinian society. And yet they knew exactly how to cook seadas and cipulas, all the stuff you buy in Sardinia. It was amazing. They knew the songs. I think some have a harmonium, fisarmonica in Italian. It was incredible. And so I think these are very strong connections. And even so, we can make that connection with ourselves, with our ancestry, because very important, in my opinion, the ancestors are not very far. They're there. We can see them, but they're still there. And energetically, they want us to be happy and to love who we are. Because if you don't love yourself, you're going to become ill. You're just not going to be well, aren't you? Because you love part of yourself, and these are in yourself the memories of these people. So energetically speaking, we need that love and that acceptance, because when we hate, things are not going to well. So I'm really thankful that you brought this. You know, it's a very deep, heartbreaking thing to hear how much pain there is when we reject who we are and where we come from, because there's nothing wrong in being from another country compared to somebody else. Who cares?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
At the end of the day, we're all just people. And I always say when we all die, you can't tell which skeleton was Jewish or which skeleton was Palestinian or which skeleton was black or white, right? We are all just skeletons.
We're all the same skeleton. Look at me, I'm doing well for that skeleton already.
100%. And I think like there's a lot of like ego in focusing on our differences instead of our similarities, which is, in my opinion, leaning into our soul. And I try really hard to lean into soul more than ego. And I hope that we move towards a world where people embrace their culture, embrace their race, embrace their religion, and celebrate it. And that we can, you know, be curious and empathetic and loving towards each other and ourselves. Right. But you're right. If you don't love yourself, you can't choose the right people. You can't find that type of love, because everything starts from within you first.
Yeah. Love yourself so you can love others. You know, for the Christians, is love your neighbor as you love thyself. And how are you going to love yourself if you think your own culture is wrong, you don't even speak the language in the house, and you have to eat only like the other people? Why? It's just food, you know. So just enjoy and make festivals instead of wars, to rejoice over differences, which this is why people drive and fly to visit the rest of the world, to see all the beauties. It's not all just in America or just in Africa or just in Oceania. We have so much bounty. Why don't we all just enjoy and see it? Why does it have to be all the same?
Yeah, no, 100%. It's
beyond me that we have to look at everyone being a clone. And then why just go to Barbie and make all these Barbie factories and we're all the same?
Yeah.
You know, it's a difference that makes life so good. So I think you gave us lots and lots of useful tips. But if people want to come and see you, where can they find you to vent with all the problems and see maybe some therapy, maybe some help? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I actually don't see clients anymore. I started a company called Meridian Counseling, and we have 132 therapists throughout California and throughout Utah. So we offer telehealth and in-person services, and we have therapists from all cultural and religious backgrounds. And we take all insurance plans, including Medi-Cal, up to private pay. So we have a wide range of providers and we have a wide range of clients that we service from all different backgrounds and social economic statuses. And it's something that I'm really proud of is I built a company that helps a wide range of people and brings them together with healers, right? With therapists that can really help them unpack things they're going through. So my company is called Meridian Counseling. Right now we're in California and Utah, but we are expanding to other states, hopefully in the next few years. And they can find us at meridian-counseling.com. And then my own Instagram is Sanj _ Kushner. And I talk a lot on my own account about first gen problems and generational trauma and narcissistic abuse, because those are things I'm passionate about. So if you want to reach out to me directly, you can reach out through social media, or you can check out Meridian Counseling and find a therapist there that takes your insurance.
That's brilliant. We're going to put all the links wherever you're listening, podcast or YouTube, will be all the links for you guys. You can go and see Sandra Kushner. So thank you so much for coming to the show. It's been such a pleasure and so much I learned today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Be sure you come back. There will be some more topics. I remember NPD and whatever else you told me So she will be back, guys. And hopefully this time my computer works better. So thank you everyone for being here. And if you have any questions, make sure that you contact both of us for whatever you want to know. And we'll be happy to help you. And of course, click, share, write, review, subscribe. You know what to do. It's always the same thing. So see you all next week. Bye.